Hello, my name is Renita Jefferson, and I am excited today to be able to talk with you about diversity and inclusion. We are going to start with addressing the importance of appreciating differences. Let's take a look at appreciating differences. As we think about the terminology, I thought it would be helpful if we started with defining each of those terms. So as you can see here, when we talk about appreciation, what I'd like for you to focus on are specifically the language here regarding admiration, recognition, and gratitude. It's really an understanding of how all of these come together. And then differences, as it says here, is really the characteristics that distinguish us from one another. And it's important as we think about our diversity and inclusion work, the aspect of appreciating differences. With that, we all have responsibilities. Let's speak first to the individual responsibility. At the end of the day, you have the most control over your behavior. And appreciating these differences certainly impact the way that you engage and navigate yourself either at the workplace or outside of the workplace. In addition to individual responsibility, we have group responsibility. So as you think about the teams that you lead, the increased effectiveness of teams certainly come from a place of respectful interaction and, frankly, our attitudes towards one another's differences as well as similarities. This all occurs in the space of transformation. And let's take a moment and talk about how we move through the opportunity to be in a place of appreciation. Now, often when we think about interactions with one another, our coworkers and others, we sometimes may find ourselves in a place of avoidance. And this is when we literally avoid connecting with folks. You know, you try to avoid them, you don't want to work with them. These are individuals, potentially they're coming down the hall, you dart the other way or up the stairs or whatever you need to do to avoid them. The next level is tolerance. I remember several years ago when I was teaching a workshop, at a break I had a young woman come up to me and she said to me, "Oh, I tolerate everyone. My mother said, brought me up to be tolerant of different behaviors." And I would say that there was a time in our culture where tolerance was, in fact, what we had looked to attain over time. But as we think about appreciating differences, tolerance is not really where we want to stop. You believe that folks in this space have a right to be treated respectfully, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, you may not necessarily choose them as coworkers and or customers. The opportunity really is to move into the space of acceptance. This is where recognizing differences, you pay most attention to the way in which you are the same. This has a tendency to often show up in interviews where there's been, or even social connections where we determine we've gone to the same school, or maybe we've had the same corporate career ladder, so forth and so on. And so you have a tendency, even if there are differences, to ignore them because you pay most attention to the ways which you are the same. And often this is the way that we enter into relationships, both personally and professionally. And then you have appreciation. And this is really moving to the space of you see the differences in people as positive. You enjoy them and you choose to be around them. So ideally, as we think about the idea of appreciating differences, it really is in that acceptance and appreciation space where we'd like folks to grow or to at least recognize that those are where the greatest opportunities for engagement, relationship building, and frankly, how our culture and workplace will strive over time. So it is a transformation. I like to show this slide because it really helps folks think about your team members that you work with, kind of your core team, your ancillary team, your subculture, and start to picture folks and potentially where they may fall here and what the opportunity is to move them into a place of acceptance and appreciation. As I said before, we all have an individual responsibility, but yet and still we also have a team responsibility. So let's transition to this idea of bias. And, a bias certainly is a tendency or inclination that drives us to the space of making a judgment and it's often done without question. It's an automatic response, and it's frankly a shortcut to how we interact with our world. Our biases are developed over time, and it's a way that we most comfortably navigate the space around us. Now, there's certainly an opportunity to think about how we may want to overcome bias. They will always be part of who we are and what we do, but certainly as we think through, especially the goal of this workshop, helping folks identify those biases and ways that they impact the work, their performance, and their engagement, let's be mindful in how we can consider overcoming some of those biases. So moving from that space of automatic response, you certainly want to be aware of your bias. You want to make conscious choices. And then you also want to challenge your decisions. Again, this happens very quickly. This is thought-provoking work, but as we start to learn more and more about the impact of bias, being aware, making the right choices, and challenging our decisions will move us away from those quick decisions. Leveraging small acts can also go a long way as we, again, individuals consider how biases can negatively impact our experience at work. We want to leverage small acts of conscious efforts to mitigate bias activities. So as we think about promoting inclusion, what are the ways that, again, we can move in that bias space more actively? And the way that we can do that is being mindful of how we want to promote inclusion in the workplace. And I have some examples here for your consideration. There are certainly many more, but these are some that I think are, and based on the workshops I've done and folks that I've spoken with, these are some of the, I'll call, low-hanging fruit. Often these are the results of employee engagement surveys we see where we ask folks to give us their comments. What are some ways that you would like to see inclusion promoted within your culture, your subculture? So this idea of offering public and private recognition, giving credit to others, and soliciting opinions and input, all very action-driven. The heads up I'll give regarding public and private recognition is the importance of working with your team members and having that conversation of how they want to be recognized. We as leaders can often assume that recognition is this blanket activity that we need to conduct, but we, as we have individual personalities and styles, you certainly will recognize you have some folks who want to be caught on stage and, confetti and the whole bit, and then you have others that simply want thank you at the time that the activity for recognition occurs, or a written note, and however that needs to occur. My guidance to you here is to have the conversation and to make sure that we are recognizing individuals as they want to be recognized. Greeting everyone, asking questions, and then this idea of just simply socializing a bit differently than perhaps you have in the past, especially as leaders. This can be really very impactful. I'm going to kind of connect having lunch with someone new and greeting everyone. So again, research data specific to a number of employee engagement surveys that I've had the responsibility to lead or come in and coach for, this greeting everyone. So why is this important? Well, what we heard from our frontline associates is that they really respected and frankly was very appreciative of leaders who just simply greeted. There were examples of coming in the hall or in the front door or wherever there's an encounter with a leader, and how employees felt when they were just simply greeted. They didn't necessarily need to be greeted by name, but just the acknowledgement, frankly, that they exist. So that idea of good morning or good afternoon versus head down, walking with the phone in the hand, or just simply being oblivious to others that are around you. You think it's a very common thing that from just being polite we should do, but often it goes by the wayside. And for some reason, this idea of a direct report and a leader in that engagement really surfaced in a number of employee engagement surveys. mixing up seats at meetings, connecting on a personal level, and again, connecting through some social engagements are other ways that you can combat bias. You know, pick one or two from that list that resonate with you and start to practice them just a bit and see if, in fact, you can increase the spirit of inclusion in the culture or subculture that you are responsible for. So how to respond if people see bias in you. And this is, again, an opportunity to hold the mirror up to ourselves specific to bias behavior. How to respond if this is an experience that others are having with you. What I'll have you consider is this opportunity to frankly stop and reflect. You know, have you allowed your frame of mind or reference to affect your judgment? Also, remember, again, if this is an experience that you're having, always, all of us carry potential for bias. We just need to be aware of them. And remember that this is not an attack. Folks are often very curious, and questions and activities may come across as bias, but for the most part, it's a space of opportunity for you to educate, frankly. And then check for understanding, reinforce your point or objective, and use performance-based examples if, in fact, there is an opportunity to do so. So stop, remember, check how to respond if people see bias in you. And then how to challenge if others are biased. And again, these are some shortcuts. There's a lot of research in this space, but I wanted to give you hopefully a few quick anecdotes that you can remember if you find yourself in these situations. So avoid accusatory language. I don't believe that X has any bearing on this, that, or the other. So this is the examples that I'll give here specific to workshops and interactions I've had is we often kind of lump together behaviors and we don't necessarily spend the time really thinking about the language that we're using. So I'm asking you to be mindful to avoid accusatory language. Whoops, I'm sorry. Hold on. Remind others of valid topics. This primarily shows up, I would say, in two ways, frankly, when we're interviewing and then also in performance management conversations. We want to make sure that we are, in fact, talking and speaking and staying focused on the topic at hand and not bringing in other anecdotal type of information that could impact the decision and therefore bias is created. And then this idea of assuming positive intent versus, again, feeling this opportunity for being accusatory. Use questions, open-ended questions here. I'm not sure I understood you correctly. What is your rationale based on what I heard you saying? You know, ways by which you can interject curiosity versus being accusatory will go a long way with opening the opportunity for conversation and relationship building versus just going on our biases. So those are two models that can be impactful as we think about how bias comes at us, frankly, and how we are perceiving bias. There's a great author here, Daniel Kahneman, and he's done a lot of work in the space called Thinking Fast and Slow. Bias in and of itself, and there's a broader workshop where we would certainly talk about the psychological impact of the activity of how bias occurs just in our brain. But Daniel does a really good job of helping us think through this knee-jerk reaction to a situation, a scenario, an interaction versus the deliberate thought. So I thought it'd be really, really good to just take a moment and look at his video, and then we will debrief the video afterwards. So let's take a look at what Daniel has to say regarding thinking fast and slow.
January 2017, we had gone to watch one of my nephews play. we're lucky today to have the Nobel Prize winning psychologist and economist, Daniel Kahneman, whose book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is one of the bestsellers of last year and a great manual for how to make better decisions. Professor Kahneman is also a partner in the consulting firm, The Greater Good. Professor Kahneman, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Your book makes use of a very useful analogy. In fact, the analogy is built into the title, Thinking Fast and Slow. System 1 is thinking fast. System 2 is thinking slow. What's the difference between the two systems, and why is it important for business decision makers to understand the difference?
Well, system 1 is essentially what comes up automatically in your memory. So, when I say 2 plus 2, something comes into your head. When I say your mother, an emotion comes. So all these things that are automatic, that's what I call system 1. And you have no control of it because it's automatic and involuntary. System 2, the slower thinking, is distinguished really not so much by the fact it's slow, although it's pretty slow, but by the fact that it's effortful and deliberate. So what you can do deliberately, you do in system 2. And you can control yourself, control your thoughts, perform complicated computations. Those things are activities of system 2. So system 1 does most of the mental work, happens automatically. We don't have to worry where to put our next foot or what word should come next. Some of the work, and it's important work, is done by system 2 when we slow down.
Do decision makers sometimes think they're in system 2 when they're actually in system 1?
I think mostly. I think most of us feel that we have reasons for what we're doing. But in fact, we do what we're doing very largely because of reasons that we're not necessarily completely aware of. And then when we're asked, why do you do this? We have reasons. But the reasons are not necessarily the causes of our action.
Does it lead to mental errors, bad decisions, because you think you've made a deliberation and you haven't?
It really depends whether you're very skilled and whether the world provides support for your skills. So, if you're a chess player and you make very quick decisions about your next move, if you're a master chess player, they're going to be moved. But the world is not like the chessboard, so it's much more complicated. And in the world, a relatively good move is not necessarily successful. So it's much more complicated, the relationship between moves and outcomes. And there, sometimes, system 2, slowing yourself down, has advantages and enables you to see things that system 1 doesn't.
You've often talked about, and one of the things that's given your research such purchase, is that people often make mistakes because they're in system 1. And even if they know that they're in system 1, or even if they're aware of the mental shortcut or short circuit, if you will, that they're doing, they can't help themselves.
Well, this isn't familiar to everybody from visual illusions. So, there are those famous illusions where you have 2 lines and one looks longer than the other, and I tell you that they're of equal length, and one continues to look longer than the other. The problem is with what we call cognitive illusions, the illusions in thinking, that it's never quite as clear-cut, that, you really believe that you're wrong. With the visual illusion, you really believe that you're wrong. But with the cognitive illusions, it continues to feel right. So you have an error, somebody tells you it's an error. Your better self tells you it's an error, but it still feels right.
Can you give me an example?
Well, there are people, there are psychopaths who instill a lot of confidence. And you shouldn't believe them because you've been warned against them. But you feel warmth toward them. And you feel that, what you must have been told, what you have been told must be a mistake because, that person is so charming. That's a cognitive illusion.
Yeah. So some people trusted Bernie Madoff and insisted that he was an honorable man.
Although they were warned. That's the key. There was something very compelling in him, and the feeling that he elicited was stronger than the warnings.
System 1, the intuitive, fast-thinking system in which most people spend most of their time, operates in a state that you call cognitive ease. Well, system 2 requires something you call cognitive strain. When you're taking the easy path of System 1, what kinds of mistakes are you prone to?
In the first place, you are going to act more impulsively. You're going to act quickly. So if your impulses turn out to be wrong, if you're not a chess player, but you're sort of living in a world where the first impulses are not necessarily wrong, you may make mistakes which, by the way, not all mistakes are avoidable, but there are some mistakes that if you brought System 2 to bear, if you slowed yourself down, you could avoid. So when you are in a sort of free-flow mode of cognitive ease and System 1 running the show, you're going to be more impulsive, you're going to be more emotional, you're going to be more optimistic, and you're going generally to follow your first impressions and your first intuitions.
And isn't that good? Haven't we read that your gut is right 90% of the time?
No, it's not right 90% of the time. The chess player's gut, if the chess player is a master, is right 90% of the time. Those are situations that allow for skill. But when we're dealing with situations, whether to invest in this or that, or whether to, we're not always there. The first impulse is not necessarily right the first time.
So
studying on Udemy?
I love that video. That video, because it does a really good job of introducing this concept of System 1 and System 2. I highly recommend, if that's of interest for you, to pick that up from Daniel. He does a really great job, and there's a couple of different videos that he does in connection with his book. So this idea of System 1 and System 2, you can see I just quickly captured a couple of the key messages. In a workshop forum, frankly, we would brainstorm through this list a little bit and potentially have an exercise for folks to do. But in light of the way that we're delivering here today, I did want to capture a few of the key messages. So we think about System 1, again, as he mentioned, this cognitive behavior. This is where emotions generally take over, automatic responses, and then this, frankly, is where unconscious bias lives. We just simply go into automatic pilot. And then in System 2 is where we take time to reflect. Cognitive strain is here, and it has us really think through our response, obviously, in a bit more time, a bit more reflective, and then we move into that space of a conscious reaction. So very fascinating psychological work here as it relates to bias. The topic of bias in and of itself, but you can see it's so much more than just that particular concept. But it's a really good example that we can use going forward. So let's talk about bias. When you think about the initial bias filters that you have, and as adults, we've gone through the journey, obviously growing up and going to college, away to school potentially, and navigated ourselves in our jobs where we may have been relocated, so forth and so on. And as this is occurring, we're bringing our bias with us. In a workshop setting, I would generally go through a brainstorm experience that is high energy, and we, do a lot of activities in the room. But for the sake of the recording, wanting to get you to this place where, as we've listed through, as I said, the activity, here are generally the bias identifiers that folks bring to the table. First and foremost, of course, it is your parents or those that you are around a great deal of time growing up. And family members. This is really where our biases start to be formed. The conversations that are occurring at the dinner table, in the car, as children, what we overhear our parents and others that we respect talk about. Certainly, our religious backgrounds, how we grew up. And how religion, if religion played a part in your growing up, school, our own life experiences, of course, school and college, think about the friends that you had when you were in school and, consider the types of things that they did and what you liked and what you didn't like, all very formative years. Teachers, professors, coaches, and mentors. So, I'm sure that all of us can right now think of a teacher, whether that was in college or high school, who had a profound effect on, frankly, how we navigate the world. I have a story of a teacher in my high school who put me on the course to go to college. It wasn't something that I thought was even attainable. And she really took an interest in me and helped me be, have that exposure to the importance of going to college. So as a first-generation college attendee, her impact was huge. And her bias in this space was it helped me to see beyond just my, safe environment of getting a job right after high school, and she opened that up for me in ways that were profound. Coaches, mentors, and then certainly TV and social media have a huge impact on how we start to see the world, again, through the filter of bias. So this is a really, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's a great way to start conversation in the room as to, why we believe what we believe, why we act the way that we act, and if we don't question some of that input, how we find ourselves somewhat stuck in that space of tolerance that I talked about a little bit earlier this morning. So the impact of bias on leadership, let's transition and talk about our role as leaders as we think about the lens that we're looking through based on the impact of some of the biases that we spoke about just now. What are some of the key areas of responsibilities that you have as leaders that you want to be mindful of? So let's start certainly first with this idea of hiring. And bias has an impact here because it frankly is the perception of a candidate, and our decision will have an enormous impact on how our culture is built. Who's coming in the door? Do we have a tendency to simply hire people who look like us? I would challenge you as leaders to think about your hiring teams. It's certainly important that we want the quality candidates, so let's just put that aside. This is really about expanding your hiring team. If you don't already have processes in place like consensus meetings, perhaps diverse slates, things of that nature, so we can, as best as possible, try to mitigate this tendency to hire people who look like us. The other area specific to leadership is managing performance. We have the responsibility for performance management, evaluations, PIP plans, mid-years, all of those things. Are we allowing differences in style and approach, often influenced by culture or other factors, to affect the perception that we have of someone and their capability? In communications, have the tendency to make decisions or just really our interaction based on the culture and style or differences. And this obviously is where language shows up. This is where just simply how someone, there's a lot of study going on in the industry specifically to what we're going to allow in our organizations. And I shouldn't say what we're going to allow, but maybe what we see more of. We are not spending a lot of time here on talking about generations, but certainly as you think about the millennial generation coming in, we have all 5 generations in the workplace, and the way that we communicate, whether that's written or text or any other social media platforms, it really is impacting the way that we communicate. So really being mindful of how biases can creep into the communication that we have with one another is huge. Certainly decision-making. This one is really one that I've encountered in my coaching, executive coaching, and this often becomes, frankly, a core of we finally get here. This is idea of, and it's hard to admit, but this is really often the basis of some of the strife that occurs, is this idea of discounting the feedback and ideas of others that are not like us. think about that. Do we discount the feedback and ideas of people who aren't like us? And how does this show up? It often can show up when we're in meetings and, someone says something, perhaps that person's voice is not as loud, or perhaps there's a thought in the room that, hey, that person is at a particular level in the organization, and maybe we don't necessarily take what they said to be an effort that we would want to champion. It shows up in a number of different ways that I have you really think about if this is an opportunity for you to consider how a bias can impact decision making. And then finally, this idea of setting the tone, creating an environment where preferences and biases work. Folks feel comfortable coming to work here. They feel comfortable, they can bring their full selves, gender, ethnicity, all of those things come into play here. Our role as leaders is to set the tone and the culture where our associates, our employees can come into work and feel comfortable. So as we think about the idea of unconscious bias or implicit bias, I hope I've given you some information to consider. There's obviously a broader breadth and a more extensive experience, but I did want to frankly talk a minute about this idea of unconscious bias and implicit bias. Unconscious bias, we've been talking about it, and so these are these automatic triggers. I've heard people use unconscious and implicit interchangeably, and they're actually two very different, not very different, they're two different topics. Unconscious bias, we've spent some time talking about. However, when you become aware of your unconscious bias, they then become implicit because you are now aware of them. You've taken the time to self-reflect, and you now have a few things that you want to start to work on. So they move from that unconscious space to that conscious space. And when that occurs, we then become responsible for our interactions, our reactions. And I just wanted to, again, introduce these two topics and give you definitions to work with. So as you hear this terminology, it gives you a sense of where, in fact, someone is on the spectrum as they're discussing bias. So as we end the session, I wanted to give, again, just a few quick thoughts of ways that you can navigate yourself in the space of bias. And I'm hoping that, with this information, taking the time to self-reflect is going to be helpful. Again, in a broader workshop setting, we go through an exercise and we help folks deep dive a bit into the space of, what is your call to action as a result of the awareness, the move from unconscious to implicit. So think through how biases may have been formed and whether or not there's any logic to them. Again, sometimes we just go on automatic pilot. I tell the story that I think it was about 3 years ago. I had a gentleman in a workshop, and it was towards the end, and then I could see he was a little antsy, and he finally raised his hand, and I called on him, and he said, I have a story to tell about bias, and I've never told this story out loud, but it was this workshop that brought this to the forefront for me. And I'll make this short, but basically what he shared with us was the fact that he was very close to his grandfather growing up, and they spent a lot of time together and had he's very respectful of him as an individual. Well, his grandfather, for some reason, he never knew why and never questioned, did not or had an issue, I'll use that word, with red-headed women. I know that's odd, right? But this is his story. And so much so that he shared this with his grandson, and that he was to avoid women with red hair at all costs because all of these negative reasons. And, the gentleman, again, sharing the story, he said, I had no reason to question it, and that's how I went through life. None of my girlfriends had red hair, and, even guys who were, potential friends of mine, if they had red hair, I avoided them because that's what my grandfather told me to do. And he was going for a job interview. I think you guys know where I'm going with this. Made his way all the way through, the opportunity to interview with the CEO, who was, of course, a woman. And as he turned the door handle to enter her office, she stood up to shake his hand. Of course, she was a woman with red hair. And he said what happened was kind of this flood of information just came back to him. And think about, again, this unconscious space that we live in. It often hits us like that. Why am I feeling this way? What is it that's made me, come to this place of a decision? And he, certainly went through the interview and gathered himself, but he couldn't help remember what his grandfather had said to him over the years. And frankly, he had to break through that. Yes, he did get the job, and they have a good relationship. But what he shared, I thought, was really profound, because it really is this idea of, is there any sound logic or reason to the way to why we have these biases? Or are they just how we operate it without really even thinking about them? So I hope that story helps you, consider how perhaps this may show up in your life. Confront why we have the bias, engage. One of the best ways to eliminate bias certainly is to prove them wrong through personal experiences. Commit and maintain. This is not a one and done. This is a journey. And as you now have this information, and I would challenge you in the next, couple of days to be more keenly aware of, as you are here at work or at home or in the line in the grocery store or wherever you are, how those judgments come into place and impact your engagement. Reflect on them, consider what you may want to do differently, and then finally, discuss your experiences. I do a couple of workshops where we introduce the idea of accountability partners. Who is that person that you can confide in, or maybe you're a journaler or whatever it takes, but, actively seek out a way to move beyond some of the biases that you've identified and do that to frankly move the needle and just improve how you engage with one another at work, and how as a leader specifically you can be a role model in the space of unconscious bias. So I hope that these six tools can get you to a place of opportunity to address your bias. All right. So let's transition to diversity and inclusion. I've been doing this work for over a decade, and frankly, when I started, it was just diversity. We weren't even doing the inclusion part, so I'm happy to see the evolution of both diversity and inclusion and the impact that it can have on an environment and a culture. Let's spend a few minutes talking a little bit about diversity. I think, especially over the last 5 to 7 years, diversity as a term, it's part of the vernacular of our culture, and there's different definitions for diversity. For the sake of our workshop, I'd like to introduce to the definition that I feel is most holistic of what diversity represents, and it's very simple. It's this idea of our characteristics make us unique and different, and sometimes from or similar to one another. So you can see there's a nice montage here, but just think about the people that are around you, again, whether at work or at home, and how there are differences. None of us are exactly the same. Even if you are a twin, there are some differences in the chromosomes a bit, but it really is just this idea of human characteristics. And then the term inclusion. So inclusion is all about, fully involving all people, regardless of their diversity in all settings. And it describes the action, frankly, of how we interact, conduct ourselves as we think about the workplace, how inclusive of our policies and procedures and practices, and, are we taking the full scope of individuals into play when we establish those policies and procedures. And when was the last time you took a look? That's often my challenge to my HR audience is, when was the last time you looked at your policies and procedures, your employee handbook, through the lens of diversity and inclusion, and where is your opportunity to start updating or adding or taking away, frankly, some language that is no longer relevant based on their culture. So why diversity and inclusion? There's certainly more than what you see here, but I thought I would talk with you about 3 areas where diversity and inclusion has a direct impact in the workplace and, frankly, the bottom line of an organization. And innovation is the first one. I'm sure that you can yourself come up with examples how important it is that we bring to the table individuals with diverse backgrounds, talents, and experiences. You know, if I got a room, and I'm making a generalization of, you know, project managers or engineers, or just think of a career focus of all the same people who've had generally all the same career experiences. For the most part, I am going to, you know, be challenged with innovation and creativity because we're all coming from the same mindset. So this idea to bring different folks in the room, I spoke earlier about generations, you know, think about your core team. Think about the teams that maybe you're responsible for putting together to come up with innovation and creativity, you know, to keep the company going forward or to bring forth an idea. It really is the mixture of these experiences that often get us to that place of breakthrough activity and breakthrough creativity that goes on in our organization. So innovation is important. Certainly customer service, as we think about the collection of skills and experiences. My global clients, making sure that we have opportunities for various, you know, multilingual individuals to come in and to offer those services, and frankly, insights and introspectives that we have as we serve our global organizations and the various cultures that are impacted there. A number of stories that I can provide, time permitting. And then time and engagement, companies, frankly, talent and engagement, companies that encourage diversity certainly, again, create a culture where associates feel comfortable. And, you know, and this one is, I have you consider just also from a brand perspective. Our applicants are a lot more sophisticated these days. They're going on to a company's website and they're looking for your diversity and inclusion statement. They're looking for how you are involved in the community. They're looking for all of these things. And so the talent that you bring in is much more sophisticated than it has been, you know, I would say in the last 10 to 15 years. And people want to be in a culture or a workplace that they feel as though they can bring their full selves, and then you get innovation and great customer service as a result. So why diversity and inclusion, innovation, customer service, talent management? So why now? Why is it important that we consider now? You know, starting in this place of trust, which I'm sure you all realize is its own workshop, day-long workshop, but the importance of establishing trust as we recognize it is 24/7. Those trusted relationships, you know, can drive amazing employee engagement because they hear what you're saying, they believe what you're saying, and then you get their full engagement. This is frankly where discretionary effort shows up. I do a workshop that talks a little bit about the importance of moving folks from compliance to discretionary effort, and they do that in the space of truly trusting their leadership. Work is definitely more complex. Many companies now have a global footprint, or at the very least, they are working with other companies that have a broader reach than just simply, you know, a company that is, I would just call it kind of one-dimensional. So this idea of the complexity of not only our workplace and what we have to do, doing more with less and using technology, but then also the broad reach in that space. Workforces are more complex with language and just the way that we do things a bit differently. Inclusion is about developing leaders that can maximize it. So they recognize the opportunity and they're, you know, utilizing the appropriate tools. They built the trust. They have the relationship. Now inclusion is happening. And then, again, this is not a straight line. So we, you know, get our best practices in place, remembering that it is our responsibilities, especially at this time when we start our diversity and inclusion journey for many of the companies that I work with, that we are looking at strategically what does this mean for us. And I talk with them about the importance of the fact that this is a journey. It is not you know, you do A, B, C, and D, and then you have this result. It really is, you know, kind of making sure that we're going back and forth and checking and rechecking because it is not a straight line. So benefits of an inclusive culture, I wanted to share some statistics and some studies with you, and you can see the reference down on the right-hand side, but significantly 81% of improved performance and or productivities are employees who work in an inclusive culture. You see the increase there of 86% of increased innovation, motivation, and this and collaboration. More and more companies are, this cross collaboration is occurring from you think about kind of a supply chain model. The interdependencies have become more and more significant of understanding not only maybe my first handoff, but the second and third, going back to the importance of quality. So improved collaboration, those relationships are being built and sustained, and leadership is modeling. Then we have higher retention numbers here, as well as improvement, as I spoke earlier about that discretionary effort. And then finally, the space of greater engagement and loyalty, and then commitment to the organization. I'm a fan of saying I've been in the talent acquisition space for quite some time, and you can have the best promotion, the best brand out there. Your marketing is on par as it relates to acquiring talent. But it is your internal employee who is your best brand, right? They're the ones that will, whether or not you have a program in place, but they will go out and talk about the experience that they're having within your organization and can move the needle. So these examples, I think, are important. So let's transition. This is where I would introduce a group exercise. We would have folks form teams, and however that would work based on the number of individuals in the room. But it's a fun way to start thinking about on your pads. I've given you a definition of diversity, but what I want you to think about is this question. Diversity, what comes to mind? And I want you to do this in the brainstorm manner, and the rules of brainstorm are, quantity, no explanation, and it's generally fast-paced. So I ask the audience, I give them about 3 to 5 minutes to document on a flip chart, diversity, what comes to mind? And then we go around the room, and each group has an opportunity to report out. I like to do this exercise because it gets us to a place where we get all of that out of our head, frankly, and we can have some really good discussions. I generally also walk around the room and circle one word that each team has captured, and I ask that team to do a deep dive for me in what that really means. Some of the responses that you will see are things like I'm showing here mental ability, the goals, perhaps I went to acceptance, social economic status is one, and there's many, many more. These are just a few quick examples. We do the same thing with the term inclusion. When you hear inclusion, what comes to mind? And what's interesting is I've had in workshops where we, as I said before, we use the term diversity and inclusion so frequently, it almost is one word, but they are two separate things. And so it is another way for people to kind of think through what that really means. And so you see here some potential examples of what will occur as a result of that brainstorm engagement. So it gets folks, and I have them walk around, so it gets them up out of their seats, engaged, some dialogue around those two terms, and then we transition into the dimensions of diversity. This, again, it's facilitated, but with audience involvement. And the takeaway from this model, frankly, is when the diversity and inclusion brainstorm is conducted specifically to diversity, what generally occurs is folks identify things here in the primary circle. So if you consider you as the person that's the identity, the primary circle, you can see things there as age and gender and race. And I ask the audience, what do these characteristics have in common? So if you take a quick look at them, I'll ask you to consider, what is it that they have in common? Well, the answer is, this is generally how you come into the world. Right? At the end of the day, as you think about your race and ethnicity and orientation, all of those things are present when you were born. You know, your age, as much as we try to change our age, the number is the number is the number at the end of the day. That's how we come into the world. And that often is where diversity or the thought of diversity stops. But there's 3 additional dimensions I would have you consider. The next one is the secondary sphere. And so the secondary sphere, if you look through some of these here, and again in the workshop I spent a bit more time talking through a few of these, you can see you have things like marital status, geographic location, your education, religion, again asking the same question, what do these characteristics have in common? And the answer is that these are generally choices that you make. And so we talk a little bit about what that means. Often and there could certainly be some answers from a diversity when I ask the question about diversity that we'll see some secondary, but not a lot. Let's take a look at the organizational and culture. These are generally the 2 dimensions that are new to folks, and this is how we bring the characteristics or the dimensions of diversity into the workplace as we think about from an organizational perspective. I generally spend some time talking about or asking the question, why would role in company be an element of diversity? And why would things like your management status or whether or not you are in the union or depending on what division and department you are a part of, why would those be elements of diversity? And ask the audience to participate, where you're located. I've had a lot of folks generally pick that one to want to talk about because whether you're a domestic or international company, I've worked for companies that have been headquartered in the north, and we've had plants in the south, and I've gone to a number of plants and they refer to us as the mothership, and the fact that they have to take orders from us and this, that, or the other, and they're not always happy about it. So sometimes the physical location of your company and its subsidiaries make a difference, frankly, in the engagement of those individuals in the space. And the same thing with culture. You know, as we think about, wow, how is culture an element of diversity? And it is, you know, things like, you know, are we an organization that works with teams, or is there a lot of autonomy and we do things individually? How is a new person assimilated into the organization to understand that that's how we manage ourselves in the culture? How are we observing traditions? You know, what days are considered days off at our organization, or flex days and things of that nature? How do we manage conflict? How do we manage risk? So this exercise, going through this model, generally takes about 10 minutes, and I try to make it as interactive as possible, but it is definitely eye-opening on the evaluations. Folks do remark on the fact that they didn't realize that the dimensions of diversity can be so broad. So it's a really good reminder. Then we have them launch into a group discussion, and similarly, we would have them in teams, and you can see the questions that we would like the audience to answer around inclusive. How inclusive is your culture? What has your organization done? To what extent are your leaders aware of the behaviors, and what challenges do you see for initiatives aimed at making your organization a more inclusive workplace? Great discussion can come from these questions, interactions. The makeup of the room does matter, I will say. I generally, again, lead this conversation in a way by which we are checking our egos at the door. And the outcome of this has been an input, frankly, to broader discussions that can carry on after the session. There is a call to action at the very end of, you know, what are you going to do differently as a result of this workshop? And some of these questions are really good to continue in small groups, just to really see, you know, how are we going to enter into this space, and frankly, how are we going to move the needle? One of the diversity dimensions of diversity that is not listed, and I wanted to just take a moment and bring that to your attention, is this idea of diversity of thought. And in 2016, did some work around the importance of cultivating the diversity of thought and the importance of boosting innovation and creative problem solving. This becomes critical, and we've already talked a little bit about how people bring their different cultures and such into the workplace, but it really is taking it a step further. You know, are we being becoming, proactive in our consideration of how we continue to sustain ourselves as an organization and being in a place of innovation and creativity. I'm sure I don't have to tell you the number of companies in the last 5 to 7 years that are no longer with us. I always have a lot of fun, and I ask the audience, how many of us have Blockbuster cards? And raise your hand. With your license and Blockbuster card would get you in the door often to places, but they didn't see Redbox coming, right? You think of other companies that we would assume would have been foundational organizations going forward, just Sears and Penny's, and you go on down the list of large companies as well as small that just did not get in front of innovation and creativity in a meaningful way. And I would argue that it's due to the lack of diversity of thought, and the expectation that you're going to have this consumer. Think of brick and mortar versus online, and we continue to see the percentages increase when we look at holiday shopping. Pick a holiday, it doesn't really matter at this point. It's no longer just Christmas. The activity that's occurring online versus the activity that's occurring at brick and mortar. So diversity of thought becomes another very important dimension of diversity. So as we think about diversity, I like this visual shared by CultureFactors, this idea of, think of diversity as this palette of color. They're all different, but yet they are all together. And then they, find themselves, if they're appropriately utilized, in this amazing, Van Gogh artist rendition here, and how cool that is that you can simply, it's the same primary colors, maybe you add 1 or 2, but then you walk away and you have this wonderful masterpiece. The other example I give that resonates with the audience is, think of diversity and inclusion in this way. So I'm going to have you go back to that 7th grade dance. Do you remember that? 7th or 8th grade dance, and we're in the cafegimatorium, right? And what generally happens, we have the girls on one side and we have the boys on the other side. Music is playing and no one is moving. So everybody's in the room, right? So we have diversity. Everybody's there. And it's those 2 brave souls that, they generally the captain of the football team and such, the cheerleader from the girls team or whoever, that step into the middle of the room and they get the dance going, and then all of a sudden everybody's on the dance floor. That's inclusion. It's really that simple. We're all invited into the room. It's really how we come together that makes a difference, and that's really how it shows up in our culture as well. So two visual examples that I hope can help with really understanding the terminology of diversity and inclusion, what it looks like, and how we can bring that into our culture. So let's transition to this idea of why workplace appreciation matters. And again, these are just a few slides that are part of a broader experience, but I thought that it was important to at least topically let you know that this is part of our offerings as we think about an inclusive culture. There's some exercises that also can go along with, how do we show up in this space? That by definition, employees feel valued, opinions count, concerns are addressed, and we've already talked about the idea of the importance of the welcoming nature of those experiences. Additional topic areas that come up for me as I talk with my audiences is around terminology specific to generalizations, assumptions, and stereotypes. And I've given you some definitions here. Generalizations, these are the way that we certainly acknowledge characteristics for groups, but we allow for individual differences, okay? And it comes out very naturally in our conversations. I've made a number of generalizations with you here today, and there's not necessarily anything that's incorrect about this, because I realize that's what's happening, but it's when we start to make decisions in a generalized way that can cause us some issues here. The same thing with stereotypes. So stereotypes, we hear this term all the time. The difference between generalizations and stereotypes is, remember I said generalizations allow for individual differences. Stereotypes do not. And this is often where we get into trouble. And I would, I'm going to point to social media and media. There's this generalization that a certain population is, responsible, or we see something and we attribute an entire population or identifying a particular group, to a behavior. And then our action it can be positive. Unfortunately, it's often negative, because we've in our mind now said that every person I encounter with these characteristics have the tendency to behave as this experience if it's been negative. I was in a workshop, and I had a gentleman share with me. He was at Disney World with his family, and they were standing in line, and I guess it was a relatively long line, and his explanation was exactly this. He said there was it wasn't a child, I think it was an adult, from his perception, and that adult had on head wrapping of some sort, and apparently he pushed through, they were line jumping, I guess. He pushed through the line so much so that he pushed one of this gentleman's children backwards. And, he had to call him on him, like, dude, why are you, stop pushing my kid or whatever. And he shared with me, he said, Renita, it ruined my entire vacation. Every time I saw anyone that had this head wrap on, I immediately reflected back to that experience, and I became angry. I could feel myself getting heated up, and just this emotion, which we often have, right? These emotional reactions was occurring for him. And he said it wasn't until, he was able to sit in the hotel room with his wife and talk through what had happened and somewhat kind of talk him off the ledge. But he said it was very vivid for him. And as we were talking about the topic of stereotyping and how that can, enter our lives, he had to wrestle with himself to get beyond, that feeling. So it's very real. Think of examples where that's occurred, for you, and potentially how as a leader you've made decisions that have been based on that type of experience because you're using stereotypes to drive your behavior. So generalizations, assumptions, and stereotypes. So fostering inclusion, as we look to wrap up here, I've given you some ideas of what are the appropriate employee, associate, however you label your folks, how you foster inclusion for employees, and you can see them listed here: adaptation to style, communication, respect, appreciation, and encouragement. And then as leaders, making decisions based on all the right factors. Coaching certainly is critical here, and mentoring, and then at the end of the day, being accountable for attitudes and decisions. So in order to do this work effectively, there's a couple of support structures. There are many, but I thought I would talk with you just about a few of them. And there are things like diversity and inclusion executive committees or councils. I've led and have been part of both of these groups. What the takeaway here is, it's critical that there is leadership, visible engagement in your diversity and inclusion efforts. So one is about just committed to the strategy and the vision. The other is the active engagement. So this is your, frontline, your diversity and inclusion council is often your frontline leaders who are actively engaged. They're visibly attending events. They are offering guidance, advice and mentoring, thank you, to our business resource networks or ERGs or whatever you have in your organization. So they're on the ground doing their work. And then you have your business resource networks, affinity groups, so forth and so on. And these are employee-sponsored networks. They are volunteer-driven. They often show up early at organizations that identify groups such as women's leadership groups, young professional groups. You have your ethnicity groups, veterans groups. These are all amazing groups. My guidance here is that these are groups that are organically formed. Those seem to be ones that sustain themselves versus assigned by leadership. We create the environment for them to exist, and we use our leadership team to help nurture those groups. But They can be so important to an organization internally as well as externally. They have been shown to be critical in assimilating folks into the culture and having a way for them to connect and then also grow. The other aspect to business resource networks that I think is an important foundational piece is, for the most part, regardless if you have an affinity with a particular group, that all groups are open. My women's leaders group, we certainly have events, but all our events are often open to whoever wants to attend. So there's a lot of work that can go behind the importance of how to set these groups up and what the expectations are. I use my groups to help with recruiting and branding and community involvement. So, and I'm sure you're familiar with the stories of a company like, I think it was Frito-Lay, and the members of their Hispanic Resource Network were responsible for a product line that didn't exist before, and all of a sudden it's this multi-million-dollar product line for them. I had that occur for me at American Greetings. My LGBT team worked with product development because Target came to us and they said, we want to introduce an LGBT line. Help us do that, American Greetings. And the product development team reached out to that particular resource network, and they were able to work with them with language, with graphics, all kinds of things. And then now there's a product line that didn't exist. So these networks can be very impactful, not only socially, but also moving the bottom line of business at an organization. And then lastly, supplier diversity. This is an area for companies that have a pretty structured supplier process or department in place. What are you doing in the space of supplier diversity? Great work that's happening here. A number of organizations are helping others identify diverse suppliers as often B or C suppliers, and it just helps you with your metrics, frankly, as you look to determine how you're moving the needle in diversity and inclusion in your organization. So leaders are also important. They help make inclusion and diversity. It's important that it stays in front of the organization. Share your story, seek opportunities, mentor, coach, and measure. We've talked a little bit about this already. And explore the individual and embedded systems of bias that you really already have present in your organization, i.e., consistent interviewing, consistent performance management processes, how you recognize and reward. So I wanted to give you just a few things to consider as, again, an initial resource that can be used for moving the diversity and inclusion and appreciating differences culture within your organization. So we are at our time of summary. Thank you so much for this time to speak with you about, at a high level, about some areas of focus that we are poised to work with your organization to train them through. We've spent some time talking about the importance of just appreciating differences. It's a good fundamental place to get started. It can be relational, and from my experiences, resonate quite well with audiences. It's a great lead-in. And then we get into the core of diversity and inclusion. What is it? How does it show up? Help us look at some ways by which we navigate in that space most effectively. Why is it important in the workplace? And then finally, what resources in our organization can help us drive the initiatives, the defined initiatives forward, and we identified a number of resources that can do that for us. So again, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and certainly the CultureFactors bringing this to the table to you on behalf of the organization. We appreciate the time. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.